Hey, welcome back to the Disturbing Illusion channel. Let me ask you a real quick question. Is there anything inherently evil or wrong about income inequality? I mean, just in and of itself. That's number one. Number two, do we have a free market? Does the free market create more income inequality? And if we don't have a free market, then does the fixed or rigged or tampered with or controlled market create this greater distance between income disparity between the high income earners and the low income earners? My thing is, if a person can more effectively and efficiently utilize their time and talent and hone their skills to create something that the market or the general public or people who are buying and selling actually want, then don't they deserve more than the lazy moron who sits on the couch, eats his potato chips, and squanders his time or talents? And what if the person who actually honed his skill and his talents and utilized his time, what if he can now employ his knowledge so that he can get his money to work for him instead of working for his money all the time? And that's what we're going to kind of talk about here. So I asked ChatGPT a question, and that question is, what is the main cause of wealth inequality? Now, I want you to notice as I go through this, and I'm not going to belabor this point because they write a lot here, but I do want to point out some highlights, and I want you to pick out what they didn't mention in the main cause of wealth inequality. They say the main causes of wealth inequality are multifaceted, interconnected, and vary depending on specific economic, political, and social context. And that's true. That's true. But it's a complex system with a lot of people doing a whole lot of different things, and there are different scales of what somebody would term wealth inequality. When you're talking about wealth inequality, are you talking about on the far end of the spectrum, the multi-billionaires who are able to climb the corporate ladder because of government handouts and now they're worth 100, 200, $300 billion, as opposed to the lowly fry cook at your local restaurant who's only making minimum wage and he's barely able to keep food on his own table? Maybe he's got to live in his parents' basement or whatever. There's a lot of space in between that scale right there. However, several key factors consistently contribute to disparities in wealth distribution. People with higher incomes can save and invest more. That's true, leading to a compounding effect on wealth over time. That's true. Wage stagnation. For many, wages have not kept pace with productivity or inflation. So they touch on something here that they're not going to mention in the entirety of this answer. While executives and shareholders' earnings have surged, and these trends have disproportionately rewarded high-skilled jobs and capital owners while displacing lower skill, lower wage workers. Differences in capital ownership. They talk about asset accumulation. Basically, the people who are just the wage earners, they only have enough money to pay for the necessities, while the people who may have an advantage in the market because of an unsaid characteristic in ChatGPT, they've got extra capital. They've got expendable capital that they can now invest on other things, which makes them more money, which widens the wealth equality disparity. Returns on capital. Wealthy individuals typically earn higher returns on investments than the average worker earns through wages, because like I said, the people who are earning the wages and they're basically a wage slave, most of them don't even have enough money to pay next month's rent, let alone an extra $100 to sink into some stock somewhere. Inherited wealth. Says tax policies, regressive tax systems. Says lower tax rates on capital gains, dividends, and estates benefit the wealthy disproportionately. Tax avoidance and loopholes. High income earners often use sophisticated strategies to minimize tax obligations, widening the wealth gap. Wealthier families can afford a better education. The increasing demand for specialized high-skilled labor has left low-skilled workers with few opportunities. Well, what's the answer to that then? The answer is you have 24 hours in a day, just like I have 24 hours a day and everybody else. So the key is to utilize your current skill set, add to that skill set, and effectively and efficiently use your time so you can leverage your labor and offset it with knowledge so that you can be earning on both sides of the scale, not only being a hard worker, say a construction worker or whatever, but you take a percentage of your income and then you do a risk on trade or whatever it is and invest that extra money instead of then going to that movie or buying that expensive Starbucks cup of coffee. You're going to save it and you're going to invest it later. So now your money's going to be working for you instead of you working for the money. Structural economic factors, monopolies, and market power. This kind of touches on it too, but doesn't actually mention the root cause of wealth income disparities. Concentration of economic power in a few corporations or industries allows wealth to accumulate at the top. Yes, it does. How does that happen? An economy heavily reliant on finance tends to benefit asset holders and investors more than wage earners. Yes, it does. Shifts in production and trade often lead to job losses in industry that primarily employ lower wage workers. That's true. Government policies and social safety nets. Now, we hear about a lot about expanding social safety nets from leftists, specifically progressives. Insufficient social programs, unemployment benefits, or progressive taxation can exacerbate inequality. Decline in union influence and labor rights often leads to stagnant wages and reduced bargaining power for workers. Would that be a problem if the dollar, would that be as much of a problem if the dollar maintained and retained its value? Systemic discrimination, historical and ongoing discrimination in housing, employment, and education creates wealth gaps for marginalized groups. Discrimination in lending and financial services further limits opportunities for wealth accumulation. There's a whole psychological factor involved in this. And some of their potential solutions, ChatGPT spits out, is progressive taxation, universal access to education, who's going to pay for that, redistributive policies, and antitrust measures. And then they say by addressing these structural and systemic causes, policymakers can mitigate wealth inequality and create more equitable economic systems. But guess what? This doesn't benefit policymakers. Policymakers thrive not on mitigating wealth inequality, but exacerbating wealth inequality. So I say, sounds like, at least in America, this wealth inequality is primarily created by the government's intervention in the markets. And then I say, additionally, you didn't mention the inflation of the money supply caused by central banks, which devalues the dollars everyone earns. And then they say, you're absolutely correct to point out that government intervention and central bank policies play significant roles in shaping wealth inequality. You think? Then why didn't you mention it? Matter of fact, government intervention and central bank policies don't just play a significant role. They play the top primary role. They are the ones who exacerbate the wealth inequality. So it's inherently insane to suggest that if the government and the central banks created the wealth inequality in the first place, we need to petition the government and central bankers to create policies that eradicates the wealth inequality that they created. How does that make any sense? They're not incentivized to eradicate wealth inequality. They're incentivized to exacerbate wealth inequality. And one of the ways they do that is through quantitative easing, that is money printing, that is the dilution of the M2 money supply, thereby devaluing, not just devaluing the dollars in your pocket, extracting the value from your pocket to theirs so that they can make more investments with your money that you didn't give them, that they stole from you through the hidden tax called inflation, and they make investments on other things that you can't make because you're too busy trying to put a roof over your head and food in your family's stomach. Government's role in wealth inequality. While government actions can sometimes aim to reduce inequality, they can also Really? When do they sometimes reduce wealth inequality? Just name a time. Name a time in the history of the United States where they've done that. Corporate subsidies and favoritism. Policies that favor large corporations, example, subsidies, bailouts, and favorable regulations, disproportionately benefit wealthy executives and shareholders, while smaller businesses and workers are left at a disadvantage. Not only left at a disadvantage, But smaller businesses and workers are left out of a job and out of business in a lot of cases. Overregulation in certain industries creates monopolies or oligopolies, limiting competition and innovation, which keeps wealth concentrated. Why didn't you mention this in the first place, ChatGPT? This sounds like a rather enormous thing. This is a Mount Everest-sized problem that you didn't mention while you're talking about all the little grassy knoll stuff. You got Everest, 29,000 feet hanging in the background, and at 5 feet above sea level, you're trying to discuss all of this. That's utter programmed dishonesty, in my opinion. Capital gains and dividends, sources of income for the wealthy, are taxed at lower rates than wages, incentivizing the accumulation of wealth through investments rather than labor. And then wealthy individuals and corporations can exploit those loopholes, avoiding paying their fair share, like Bernie says. While well-intentioned, certain labor laws can inadvertently harm low-income workers by reducing... Really? Well-intentioned inadvertently harm low-income workers by reducing job opportunities or limiting mobility? You've got to be kidding me. The role of central banks and monetary policy. The inflation of the money supply by central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, is a critical driver of wealth inequality, often overlooked in mainstream discussions. And why is it often overlooked if it is the major problem? The biggest problem. Why is it overlooked in mainstream discussions? Because CIA infiltrated Operation Mockingbird, MK Ultra Media doesn't care about the people. They care about protecting special interests and lobbies and defense contractors and the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex and all the money transferring that happens between the central banking cartel. Central banks inject money into the economy by buying financial assets, which raises asset prices. This disproportionately benefits asset holders, the wealthy, while doing little for those who rely on wages. Doing little? No, it does a lot for those who rely on wages. It diminishes the purchasing power of every dollar they went out there to sacrifice their time and labor to earn. Artificially low interest rates encourage borrowing and investment in the stock market, benefiting those who own stocks while leaving wage earners in the dust. Erosion of savings. When central banks increase the money supply, the purchasing power of the dollar declines. People on fixed incomes or those with limited access to investment opportunities suffer the most. And you don't think this is intentional? You don't think this is by design? You don't think the disparity is widening primarily because the policymakers are dead set on widening the disparity? And I wanted to point out this: addressing inflation and wealth inequality. To mitigate the role of monetary policy and wealth inequality, you could return to a system of stable currency like the gold standard, or a decentralized alternative like Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency that could reduce inflationary pressures. You think? Central banks should prioritize long-term economic stability over short-term market gains. Policies that incentivize saving and investment for middle and low-income households could help narrow the wealth gap. Yes, it absolutely would. Because if you stop eating away at a person's saving and devaluing dollars, then their savings would actually be worth something. Nobody's incentivized to save money. Let's say put $500 in a vault somewhere, so that you can take that $500 out and invest it somewhere, when the value in that vault is continuing to deteriorate with every passing year, with every policy from the policymakers, and with the quantitative easing policies, which is money printing from the central banking cartel. Conclusion: while free market mechanisms have their own limitations, much of the wealth inequality in the U.S. stems from government and central bank actions and disproportionately benefits the wealthy. Addressing these structural issues through sound money, reduced intervention, and genuine competition could help create a more equitable economic system. Why isn't the Republican Party talking about this? Why isn't the Democrat Party talking about this? Why doesn't Bernie Sanders and the progressives talk about this? We know, because they aren't working for us. They don't represent us and our interests. They represent the big money corporations and the banking cartels. period. And until we put the axe to the root of that tree, we can't solve any of our problems. Leave your thoughts about this for the world and the global thought police in the comments section below. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification icon, give it a thumbs up, share it with everybody you know. Don't forget to subscribe to my email list through my website, highimpactflix.com. If you want to support the channel further, become a member, buy a shirt, but more importantly, accumulate knowledge. Knowledge is power, and knowledge is the only way you're going to empower yourself. I'll see you in the next video.